Circus Francordia has been operational since 1976, and they have it all. Trapeze artists, clowns, magicians, food, and rides. But what they're really known for is their animal acts, especially the Elephant Parade, where dozens of the world's biggest mammals are shown off with their masterful tricks and ability to wow crowds of thousands of people at a time. Germany is one of the very few countries in the world to still have an operational circus. Some, like Cirque du Soleil, have done away with animal acts entirely. It's understandable, since accounts of animal abuse in circuses have plagued their history ever since they started doing the rounds hundreds of years ago. Animal activists, bringing a better understanding of what is humane and what is not, led to animals on the stage being slowly phased out of practice. The handful of places that still have animal shows are under constant scrutiny. They follow procedures and take care of their animals to the utmost degree of safety that is possible. Unlike others, Circus Francordia prides itself for its proper handling of their animal stars. June 14, 2015, was a busy night as usual for the performers of Francordia, both for the humans and the animals, that is. The animals ended their shows at 10, leaving the acrobats and clowns to continue their spectacular feats until midnight. Keeping the lions, tigers, bears, and massive elephants up any later would be disastrous. As well-trained as these beasts are, they get tired too. Their handlers herded them back to their enclosures, filling their feeding troughs as they went. Most of the men and women managing the animals behind the colossal lighted stage were in full costume. They needed to get back to their posts for the next performance, but the routine was nothing new to them by now. Within minutes, every animal had a full bowl of food and water, and their cages were securely fastened. So, with only the sounds of cheering crowds in the distance, the beasts, large and small, settled in for the night. It's somewhere in this 2-hour window that a human with nefarious plans began moving around between the cages. A man, who had just been a spectator in the crowd a few moments ago, slipped out of the main entrance when the final elephant parade had finished. It took him 20 minutes to work his way around the circus grounds, making sure to remain in the shadows until he reached the very back entrance. From there, you could reach the animal enclosures, a spacious area the size of a football field with a practice area at its center. On the outskirts of the fenced-off field, cages and trailers dotted the landscape. Lions growled sleepily, and every now and then an elephant would snort as they drank and ate their evening rations. The man's plan was to open every cage he could reach and to leave the gate open for them so that they could make their way to freedom. Whether or not he convinced himself that he could give the animals freedom, or maybe he just wanted to spread as much chaos by letting dozens of confused and dangerous animals loose in the streets, there's just no way to tell what the madman's thought process was. The closest metal cage to him held an elephant named Baby. She had been with the circus since she was born 34 years ago. The staff affectionately called her Baby because she was such a well-mannered and even cuddlesome animal. The performers liked to sneak her treats when her trainer wasn't looking, and she was a definite favorite of the employees. The man grabbed the thick metal handle of the padlock and dragged it back as quietly as he could, but the metals squealed against each other, echoing horribly across the field. The animals were startled by the sound, and there was a flurry of movement from their cages. The bears pawed noisily at the bars, the lions roared and growled, and the elephants stomped with agitation. Even the llamas and zebras at the other side of the field started neighing. The upsurge in noise and movement alerted the 2 guards that were on the far side of the field. They immediately went around with their flashlights, checking on each individual cage. The man at Baby's cage fled into the darkness. He'd have to rethink his strategy and come back another night, maybe with some oil to grease up the noisy clasps. By the time the guards reached the middle of the field, he was already out of the main back gate. He didn't bother to snap the bolt back in place behind him. Instead, he'd only drawn the gate closed, essentially leaving it open, even though it looked locked to someone casually walking by. That's also the state he'd left Baby's cage in. The night wore on, The guards, the staff, and even Baby were completely unaware of the unbolted cage and gate. The performers finished their acts, and the spectators made their way home. Slowly, Circus Francordia became completely silent. The only movement was the guards patrolling the grounds every hour or so. At around 4 in the morning, it was still dark out when the guards made their final scan of the grounds, tents, and stalls. Most of the animals were still fast asleep, but some were starting to stir. Baby was one of those early risers. When the flashlights passed her enclosure, she decided it was time to have some water before catching another hour or two of sleep before it got light out. When her large frame skimmed the gate that had been open all along on her way to her water trough, it swung open with a soft whine. Baby, curious, nosed the rails with her trunk. The gate opened completely under her gentle prodding. The enormous animal was remarkably silent as she gingerly stepped out of her cage. She'd never been without a human companion outside of her holdings, so this was a new experience for her, and she inspected every nook and cranny of the ground below her and the fence behind her cage, making her way silently to the open gate that was only a few feet away. To her surprise, the gate swung open at the touch of her trunk, too. Her timid exploration had now turned into an exciting adventure, and Baby didn't hesitate to step out into the street. On the ground, she found a discarded hamburger that she didn't like the taste of, then a few lone French fries lying on the ground. She decided that these were delicious, and she ventured out further to see if she could find some more. She nosed a few trash cans and stuck her trunk into a drain hole, wandering farther and farther away from her familiar surroundings. When the darkness started turning opaque on the horizon, Baby decided it was time to go home. It would be breakfast soon, and besides the few potato chips, she hadn't found anything edible on her way. But Baby realized that she was utterly and completely lost. Even though she was less than a mile away from the circus, she had no idea how to get back. Starting to panic, she allowed her nose to lead her. The only friendly smell underneath the oil, tar, and concrete smell of the city of Bunchen was the scent of foliage, trees, and dirt somewhere in the distance. So she followed it, not knowing where else to go. Right on the outskirts of Bunchen, a little under 2 miles away from the circus, there is a forested area that locals like to stroll around in, and children often play games during the summer months. It offered Baby the protective canopy of the trees and a place to hide as the streets became busy with early risers on their way to work or out for a walk. It's only thanks to the semi-darkness that no one noticed the massive animals strolling through the streets. The unfamiliar smells and noises were too much for Baby. She quickened her pace when she saw the trees and hid amongst the branches, working her way deep enough into the brush to hide her completely from the nearest road. As the circus woke up and the rounds to feed the animals and clean up last night's mess began, the workers made their way slowly past the animals' cages. Baby's enclosure was at the farthest side of the field, and they'd reach her at the very end of their rounds. As the circus workers made their morning rounds, another man was getting ready to start his day. Maximilian was newly retired, and at 65, he wasn't quite ready to get out of his years-long routine of getting up early in the morning like he did when he worked as an engineer at the city's power station. This Sunday was like any other day he'd had this past year since he'd retired. He put on his walking shoes and headed out to the hiking trails in the forest behind his house. He'd usually spend about 2 hours taking a leisurely stroll, stopping only to pick up a can or a discarded newspaper that loiterers had left behind. He liked keeping his favorite route clean so much that he even carried a trash bag with him every morning to maximize his cleanup. Once he was done, he planned on stopping at a bakery for some breakfast rolls that were still hot from the oven. Whistling, he walked. Baby cowered in fear just around the next crop of trees, and at the same time, the staff at Franconia saw the open cage and the gates standing ajar. As they raised the alarm, Maximilian came around the bend and stopped mid-whistle when he looked up and saw the impossibly enormous gray animal right in front of him. Baby, almost apoplectic with fear and confusion, stumbled backwards away from the stranger, making the horrible, high-pitched noise. But she backed into a large boulder that hit her painfully behind her back legs. A car alarm went off in the distance as Baby lunged forward in blind panic, the tiny human in front of her staring open-mouthed at the huge creature rearing up on its hind legs. The elephant screeched so loudly as she reared up that the shopkeepers a mile away heard it. Her front legs hit back down on the ground with such a force that the ground beneath Maximilian's feet quaked so hard that it knocked him down on all fours. With his head down, he didn't even see Baby rushing forward, running straight at him. The next moment, a massive foot came down on Max's back. 7 tons of force bore down on Maximilian, driving him several inches into the dirt. Every organ in his chest and abdomen exploded, and every bone along his spine was shattered into hundreds of pieces. The implosion was so forceful that pieces of his lungs and heart were catapulted into his throat and out of his mouth as the crushing weight forced everything inside his body to spew out of whatever it could find. Maximilian's death was almost instantaneous. In his right hand, he was still gripping the trash bag filled with a few cans and candy wrappers. That's how his poor wife found him 2 hours later when she went out looking for him. By that time, the police had already been called about the missing animal, and they descended upon the gruesome scene. Maximilian's wife was placed under sedation and treated for shock, but otherwise there were no other victims of the frightened elephant's fight. Baby was found behind another crop of trees and boulders, hiding from the approaching horde. The policemen were wise enough to wait for her handler to coax Baby out of the brush. Baby ran to her master. The animal's relief was palpable in the air, as the creature shook so violently from her ordeal that even her big ears were quivering. The decision was made that Baby probably didn't even know she'd harmed anyone, nor did she show even the slightest amount of violence toward any of the humans that approached her. Even Maximilian's wife agreed that the tragic events were the result of a panicked and frightened animal who meant no harm. So instead of subjecting Baby to an execution, she was moved to Safari Park Stukenbrock on the other side of the country. She now lives in a wide field of her very own, with 3 other elephant bulls to keep her company. And even though police could ascertain that the cage and gate were opened by a human, judging by the men's sized footprints leading to and from Baby's cage, the man in the night was never identified. He might have thought about coming back, but with the new security measures in place, that would be virtually impossible to achieve without detection. So we will probably never know the identity of the man responsible for the horrendous events of that day that led to an innocent 65-year-old man's terrifying final affliction. We've covered plenty of cases of people killed by animals in zoos and parks around the globe. And usually it's because of negligence or spectators that act foolishly. But today's case is a little different. This time, all of the safety procedures were followed to the T, but the brown bear in question was hell-bent on getting out of that cage. And it serves as a reminder that animals are much, much smarter than we give them credit for. The year was 2017 at the Orsa Rovdjurspark in Sweden. It's a famous place in Scandinavia since it's Europe's largest predator park. They offer the rare opportunity to get up close with leopards, lynxes, bears, wolves, and just about every large meat eater known to man. In early August, there was an unusual upswing in mood at the park. With autumn now almost on their doorstep, the hibernating animals began to get nervous. Out in the wild, they'd have been spending the next 3 months storing up as much fat as they possibly could in preparation for their long sleep in winter. Summer and spring is all about mating and fighting for dominance, but in autumn, the bears actively hunt other animals. Meat allows them to store more fat than vegetation would, so naturally autumn is the time of year when most attacks against humans happen. Bears can get especially antsy in their holdings. They root and rummage at everything in sight, making quite a mess. And if they're kept together, that's usually when they get into fights. The 2-year-old brown bear in this enclosure was no different. It had been pacing back and forth for days, trying to get rid of all that nervous energy. Its enclosure was tucked away in a large wooded area, with a separate holding attached off to the side. The smaller holding was used to lock the animals in during feedings, so that staff could come in to clean up and change out the water on cleaning days. But this day wasn't according to the usual schedule. This bear had made an enormous mess during its nervous pacing. There was scat thrown around everywhere, trees were scratched, and the water trough was thrown over, leaving a muddy mess that just added to the stink and the chaos. The young man put in charge of cleaning was a new hire. He was only 19 years old, and he'd begun working at the park as soon as he finished high school, with plans of studying zoology or veterinary sciences after taking a gap year. His name was never disclosed, so we'll just call him Sven for now. Sven took to the job like a dream. He was a personable young man and eager to jump in wherever he was needed, and he genuinely enjoyed working with the animals. As the rookie on the yard, it was expected that he would do the more uncomfortable jobs, but Sven didn't mind at all. One employee lured the bear to the small holding with food, and once the lock was securely behind it, the man walked off to the next holding, leaving Sven and his spade to scoop up all the debris and to shovel some dry ground on the mucky spot under the water trough. It was going to take Sven quite a while to get it all done, and there were plenty of other animals waiting for their breakfast. The gate behind, where the bear was now hungrily gobbling up its rations, was secure and locked. The staff hadn't done anything wrong at all. The animal finished its food and sat in its holding, staring at the man cleaning its cage. The little square was not meant to hold animals for longer than their feedings. It took only a minute or two before it started clawing at the earth beneath the fence, furiously digging to get out. Sven didn't think much of it. The bear's furious grunts and the soil that it scuffed up as it dug just looked like how it usually kept itself occupied. He simply turned his back on the fence and continued to shovel heaps of manure into a burlap sack. But the animal was slowly working itself into a frenzy. At first, it just wanted to dig itself out, but the more it pumped its arms, the more adrenaline flowed into its body. The lone man off in the distance was no longer just a curiosity. He was an enemy. And even if it didn't know why, all it knew was that the man needed to be destroyed. It took it just 10 minutes to dig right under the fence. The heavy-duty chain-link fence only went down into the ground for 2.5 feet, so it wasn't exactly a difficult task for the beast to accomplish. When it had a hole big enough for its head and shoulders to fit through, it began to squeeze its massive frame under the fence. Sven didn't even hear the grunts and the digging go quiet behind him. He had reached the halfway mark of his job and he began to speed up, hoping to finish before the morning was over. He only realized that something was wrong when the huffing and puffing came closer. When he turned around, the bear had already gotten out from under the fence and was running at the boy at full speed, just a few feet away from him. At this distance, Sven had no chance. He only had time to put up his hands in defense before the animal was on top of him. Never mind even trying to run. The bear slammed the young man into the forest floor, sending them skidding through the mucky soil. The impact with the ground and the nearly 200 pounds on top driving him down was so intense that it broke 3 ribs instantly. Before they even came to a stop, Sven was swinging his fists and screaming for help. His fists merely bounced off the massive hairy body, and the creature didn't even flinch. Instead, it drew back its head, opening its jaws wide and bit down, managing to grab Sven around the left shoulder. Shaking its head, it swung Sven so fiercely that its teeth tore clean through the flesh, and Sven went flying through the air, followed by a jet of blood, fabric, and bits of skin. Another colleague who'd finished up early had come by to see if he could jump in and help Sven with the cleanup job, and he saw the beast rushing at him. He yelled over his shoulder for assistance, grabbed the main gate, and rushed in despite the incredible danger he was putting himself in. Behind him, 4 other men who were in the vicinity were already rushing in after the lone savior. But the creature was already on top of Sven again, and this time there were no more screams. They didn't know it then, But when Sven was thrown through the air, his head connected with a rock, splitting his skull cleanly in two. Sven, in his last moment of consciousness, realized that the jaws closed in on him again, this time on his chest and neck. He felt himself be grabbed by those jagged claws, the nails searing through the skin on his back, and then the world went dark. The 5 men running into the enclosure were screaming and waving their arms. One managed to pick up a branch, and another grabbed the spade that Sven had been holding just a moment before. The animal turned to the approaching noise, roaring in its feral anger. But when it saw how many of them there were, it bolted into the cover of the trees. It might have been murderously angry, but it wasn't stupid enough to take them all on at once. The zookeepers grabbed the bloody heap that was Sven and hauled him out of the cage as fast as they could, not bothering to check his wounds or even if he was breathing. There was no time. They had to get Sven and themselves out before the beast changed its mind and decided that they too were fair game. Slamming the gate closed behind them, they jumped into the nearest golf cart. Normally, the little vehicles were used to carry food and supplies around the park. Never before had they used it to carry an injured human, or animal for that matter. The driver radioed in, demanding that the front desk call for an ambulance. They rode to the front gates and waited for 15 minutes before help arrived. In those minutes, it became starkly clear that things weren't looking good for Sven. His chest, shoulder, and neck were torn to shreds, but most of the bleeding was coming from his head. His previously sandy blonde hair was matted with dark blood, and even through the pouring torrent, they could see the crack in his skull. Remarkably, Sven was still breathing, but the damage to his brain was already apparent. He began to convulse just as paramedics arrived, and his colleagues grabbed his head, keeping him from slamming his already shattered skull into the ground. Paramedics took the boy and rushed him to hospital where doctors spent 12 hours in surgery trying to save what they could. But it was all for nothing. Sven never woke up from his coma, and with every seizure, his vitals continued to drop. Finally, 2 days after the attack, he breathed his last. By then, the bear had long since been euthanized, and the corpse removed from its holding. The cage stood empty for months, but it was the one that was most visited in the entire park. Every employee and a large number of public visitors laid down flowers and teddy bears along the chain-link fence to show their condolences. Police were able to prove that staff didn't do anything wrong. At the very least, this was not because safety procedures weren't taken, but it did prompt the park and many others in the country to line every animal's holdings fences with concrete that went at least 4 feet down into the ground. They were worried that more brown bears would dig under the fence enclosure and bring another zookeeper to their terrifying final affliction. John Varty's Tiger Canyon Wildlife Farm sits in the Free State province of South Africa. South Africa has its fair share of big nature parks and wildlife reserves, but Tiger Canyon is different in a big way. Tigers don't naturally occur in Africa at all, but John Varty, the acclaimed filmmaker and wildlife conservationist, opened the park to create a breeding program to combat China's dwindling Bengal tiger population. For years now, Varty has played the biggest role outside of China in bringing the magnificent cats populations back to their former glory. But the farm doesn't just hold the imported tigers and their cubs. It's the place to visit if you want to see exotic cats. Lions, leopards, cheetahs, they've got it all. And just a few miles away is the Londolozi Game Reserve, an upscale resort that plays host to most of the tourists who come from all over the world to visit the best place to see all of the big cats in one place. But March 2017 was an unusually relaxed time for the staff at Tiger Canyon. They only had 2 groups of tourists consisting of about a dozen visitors altogether, and most of them were in their 20s and 30s. The 2 groups naturally got along with each other as well as the staff members. It wasn't long before both the people who worked at the farm and the tourists had a few parties and barbecues together. It's not exactly encouraged to mingle too closely with the tourists, but South Africans are a friendly bunch, so it's easy to see how the outsider's visit went from business to pleasure so quickly. On Friday, March 24th, Tiger Canyon's manager, Jacob Pieters, took all of their visitors on a game drive to see the entire farm from top to bottom. During this time, his wife Sophie and their 3-year-old son prepared dinner for their guests. By late afternoon, the lot had returned and devoured the food set out for them. Jacob and Sophie left for the evening, leaving their guests in the care of a handful of staff members. But unbeknownst to them, the moment they left, the party started. Out in the wilderness with no one in earshot, the group lit a fire and got started on a party before it even got dark. By 10 that evening, almost all of their booze was finished, but not to worry, the South Africans who were partying with them had plenty of contacts who could sort them out in no time. A few phone calls later, one of the partying staff members took a walk to meet a taxi on the dirt road that led to Tiger Canyon. They exchanged cash with some booze, and the taxi driver drove away. But while walking back with the booze, he decided for some reason to stop behind the cheetah enclosures. Inside were 4 cheetahs held behind a metal fence. He needed to open a gate, walk through the enclosure toward another gate on the far side of the cage, and then he'd enter the area where the bungalows and reception buildings were. The people who worked at Tiger Canyon got along well with the usually dangerous animals. They'd been born in captivity, and even though they weren't exactly tame, they were very friendly with the people who fed and cared for them. They simply stared at the man walking through their home curiously from behind the bushes and trees. Cheetahs are some of the smallest of the big cat family, and they prefer to hunt small game. Even if they had been hungry, which they were not, the humans striding through the enclosure were a little too large for their usual tastes. That's not to say that they won't attack if they're especially hungry or when they're threatened, because they absolutely will. But the cheetahs knew the staff members fed them every morning and evening, and they had no interest in hurting them at all. But the staff member who'd walked through with his hands full of their beverages kicked the last gate closed behind him without latching it shut at all. As the party wore on until the early morning hours, that gate stood seemingly closed, but in truth it could swing open with even the slightest draft. When the music turned off and everyone went off to bed, everything became silent. Cheetahs are incredibly curious creatures, so it shouldn't be surprising that one of the 4 came nosing closer, its snout in the air, smelling the empty bottles and snacks that were left outside the bungalows. Before the sun came up, the cheetah was out on the grounds, scavenging the crumbs and whatever else was left behind. By 6 a.m. the sun was out, and the staff members, hungover and sour, started making their rounds. The escaped cheetah slunk back into some bushes when the movement around him became apparent. By the time that Jacob, Sophie, and their young son pulled into the parking lot, the evidence of the previous night's goings-on was already cleared, and no one noticed that one of the cheetahs was missing when they threw chunks of meat over their fence for breakfast. But now, up in a tree, the predator was watching silently and almost invisible as the people on the grounds made their rounds. It had missed breakfast, and its stomach was empty. It immediately spotted the toddler, and little Jacob was of a much more appropriate size for the cat to try for. At 7 a.m., Sophie headed into the kitchen to start preparing breakfast, and Jacob Sr. went out with his Jeep to feed the tigers on the other side of the park. The park stretched for hundreds of acres, and Jacob would be gone for the next few hours at least. Sophie left her son to play with his toy trucks and plastic animals like she normally would. Every cat in Tiger Canyon had dozens of acres, and every one of those enclosures was fenced and gated. They'd never had an animal escape, so the chances of little Jacob meeting a predator was almost non-existent. While she cooked and set the tables, Jacob played happily in the grass and sand. His back was turned to the trees where the cheetah was perched. Sophie was in the kitchen, and all of the staff were either cleaning up a bungalow or out feeding the lions, leopards, and tigers. The creature climbed down to take advantage of the opportunity, heading straight for the blond boy playing in the morning sun. Its padded paws made no noise as it stalked closer to the boy, its shoulders brought high and its head held low. Now it was out of the grass and in full view of the vast green lawn. If anyone had come by in those seconds, they'd have seen the animal immediately, but no one was there except little Jacob, singing nursery rhymes while he drove his truck on his hands and knees. Engrossed in his game and in his song, the boy had no inkling or warning of the thing that sprang on his back. The cheetah took a leap, folded its claws around Jacob's chest, and bore its fangs into his face. The boy screamed in terror and pain, pinned to the ground, helpless to run or fight. Jacob's attacker released its hold on Jacob's face and bit down again. This time, its aim was fatal, right between the ear and shoulder. The cheetah had Jacob by the neck. Blood spurted over its yellow-spotted fur, and it increased the force of its grip, cutting off all oxygen to Jacob's brain. Jacob's hysterical screams were cut off instantly when the animal took hold of his throat. By that time, everyone in the vicinity ran out to investigate the sound. Sophie immediately knew something was wrong when she heard her son's panicked yell. She ran from the kitchen, dropping a stack full of plates as she went. At the door, she saw the gruesome scene on the lawn. The cat was straddling her boy. There was blood everywhere. With an anguished wail, she ran even faster, but a gardener nearby was already streaking across the grass. He reached the boy first. With his bare hands, he grabbed the cheetah around the waist and lifted it into the air. The animal wasn't letting go without a fight. Jacob was hauled up with it for a moment, but his weight and the worker's yank ripped the nails and teeth right through his skin. The claws dragged across Jacob's small chest, leaving raw grooves behind, and the fangs tore his throat to shreds. Then Sophie was there, just as Jacob fell from the animal's grasp. She immediately grabbed him by the neck, trying to stem the torrents of blood that were streaming from her son's wounds. The man, strengthened by adrenaline, threw the 100-pound raging cheetah across the lawn. The cheetah yelped when it struck the ground. It bounded on its feet the moment it landed, streaking away, back into the cover of the wilderness. Jacob wasn't conscious, but he was still breathing, a horrid gurgling sound that sent bubbles of blood out from his mouth. Sophie managed to keep her hand steady for 20 minutes, not daring to move Jacob for fear that he'd bleed out if she lost her grip. Then the emergency helicopter arrived, landing right there on the lawn. Jacob Sr., still out in the field, saw the helicopter flying overhead and land around the place where his wife and son should have been. He jumped in his car, thinking one of the rowdy tourists had gotten into some sort of accident or another. But to his horror, he arrived in time to see his wife and the limp and bloodied body of his small son climbing into the aircraft. He didn't bother to see if anyone was all right. Jacob got right back in his truck and raced to the nearest town, the closest place that the helicopter would find a suitable hospital. When he arrived, his son was in surgery, and Sophie was in the waiting room where hospital staff had already given her a clean set of clothes. But it was too late. Jacob was brain dead long before they reached the hospital, though he remained stable and breathing for several days in his hospital bed. His parents had no choice but to take him off life support, to spare him and themselves the agony of seeing him die a slow and drawn-out death. Authorities decided that the attack was a result of human error, and the cheetah in question was recaptured and placed back in its enclosure. New spring lock bolts were placed on every gate in Tiger Canyon. The 4 staff members who'd been drinking with the tourists were all fired for their behavior, and the staff member who smuggled in the booze and left the gate open was charged with involuntary manslaughter. But given the fact that it was truly an accident, he never saw the inside of a prison cell. Jacob and Sophie Pieters never set foot on the grounds again. Working on the location where their son had been attacked was too much for them to bear. Even still, they will never forget the day that their son, 3-year-old Jacob Pieters, met his terrifying final affliction.